The air in the Grand Hall of Seoul's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was as cold and sterile as the polished marble underfoot, a deliberate chill designed to keep tempers cool and minds sharp. Along the walls, a forest of national flags stood in silent, stiff attention. Dominating the space behind the podium was an enormous cerulean banner, its crisp white lettering proclaiming the purpose of this global gathering, the East Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Forum, ASEAN Bonds, and the Indo-Pacific Reality. This was a special session convened and orchestrated by the South Korean government, and the guest list was a testament to its perceived importance. Ambassadors from 7 key ASEAN member states sat in the front rows, their faces impassive masks of diplomatic neutrality. Delegations from China and the United States were present, as were sober-suited representatives from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The room was lined with a bristling hedge of television cameras from every major global news network, their red recording lights like a constellation of malevolent eyes, all broadcasting live. The world was watching. Stepping to the podium was the Korean Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was a man in his prime, sharp-featured and radiating an almost unnerving self-assurance. He offered a perfunctory bow before placing his hands firmly on either side of the microphone, as if claiming ownership of the very air in the room. Today's agenda, he began, his voice resonating with manufactured gravitas, concerns the structural reform and economic revitalization of ASEAN. And we, the Republic of Korea, will be at the center of that effort, guiding the new order in this region. The moment the simultaneous translation whispered into the delegates' earpieces, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. It was as if the carefully calibrated pressure had suddenly dropped, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence. The incessant flash of cameras ceased. The furious scratching of pens on notepads went still. A ripple of unease washed over the ASEAN ambassadors. They exchanged fleeting, guarded glances, their expressions betraying a shared sense of alarm. Guiding ASEAN's reconstruction. The phrase landed not as a call for partnership, but as a declaration of dominion, laced with an unnerving, paternalistic condescension. From the back of the hall, a voice, barely more than a whisper, sliced through the tense quiet. "And who do you think you are?" It was not a shout of anger. It was a murmur, spoken without the aid of a microphone, yet it carried to every corner of the room with the clarity of a struck bell. The tone was not one of rage, but of profound disappointment, edged with a fine, sharp contempt. The vice minister on the stage heard it. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps embarrassment, crossed his face before being replaced by a tight, practiced smile. But that smile did nothing to warm the sudden frost in the room. In that single, fleeting moment, South Korea's ambitious gambit for regional leadership had taken its first, disastrous step toward losing the world's trust. Witnessing all of this from a seat in the press corps was Daniel Haas. A veteran political correspondent for a major British newspaper, he had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating the labyrinthine corridors of London and Brussels. Asia was, for him, uncharted territory. He had arrived with a notebook full of questions and a professional's eagerness for a new challenge, but he had not expected to be confronted with such a raw and public display of diplomatic hubris on his very first day. In the margins of his notebook, Daniel scrawled a question that would come to define his journey. Where does this Korean confidence come from? The next morning, Daniel sat in the cavernous, impersonal lobby of his hotel, a stack of local and international papers spread across the low table before him. His eyes snagged on a headline that seemed to leap off the page in bold, accusatory type. ASEAN deems Korean remarks, lacking in respect, warns of strained relations. It was clear the aftershocks of yesterday's press conference were far more severe than anyone had anticipated. Outside the ministry building, television crews had formed a media scrum around a Korean government spokesperson who was doing his best to placate the agitated reporters. There seems to have been a slight misunderstanding regarding the vice minister's comments yesterday, the spokesperson said, his voice a smooth balm of practiced placation. Korea seeks cooperation, not dominance. His tone was gentle, but the words themselves offered no comfort, no genuine contrition. A misunderstanding. Daniel circled the word in his notes, his eyes narrowing. He had covered enough political scandals and diplomatic breakdowns to know that in the lexicon of international relations, no word was more ambiguous, more dangerously loaded than misunderstanding. It was a verbal sleight of hand, a way of shifting blame without accepting responsibility. With a single word, trust could be shattered. With a moment of insincere silence, isolation could begin. His experience had taught him that much.
ASEAN.
The term had been little more than a vague geographical concept to him before this assignment, a hazy collection of nations on a map. He recalled the briefing materials he'd skimmed on the flight over. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a regional cooperative of 10 countries founded in 1967, born from the crucible of war and instability. Its founding members, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, had later been joined by Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, with East Timor on the cusp of full membership. He mumbled the key points to himself, trying to solidify the abstract facts into a tangible reality. Purpose, regional peace and stability. Promoting economic growth avoids political confrontation, non-interference in internal affairs decisions by consensus. So decision-making can be slow. Diversity is its strength, but also its weakness. 10 countries, a mosaic of different religions, political systems, and wildly disparate levels of economic development. And yet, somehow, they endeavored to work together. It was less a political bloc and more a sprawling, complicated, cross-cultural family. In that moment of reflection, the abstract entity of ASEAN began to take on a human form in his mind, a network of people and their intricate relationships. Suddenly, a young Korean journalist sitting at the next table leaned over with a wry smile. "ASEAN is just being emotional," he said in fluent, confident English. "Korea is offering a helping hand, and for some reason, they're resisting it." "Is that how you see it?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. The young man shrugged, a gesture of casual certainty. "They need a leader. Korea is the best candidate for the job." Behind the confident assertion, Daniel sensed a strange undercurrent of anxiety, a need for external validation that seemed to contradict the very dominance his country was trying to project. Later that afternoon, while nursing a coffee in the ministry's bustling public atrium, Daniel saw a cluster of foreign journalists speaking in hushed tones. He drifted closer, catching fragments of their conversation. "Heard from my source, ASEAN is preparing a formal letter of protest. The Koreans are trying to pass it all off as a misunderstanding. It won't work." The words sent a familiar chill down Daniel's spine. As he stepped out of the ministry building, the massive electronic billboards overlooking the city square were already flashing news alerts about the escalating tensions. Below them, streams of people flowed past, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphones, their confident strides betraying no hint of the diplomatic storm brewing in the buildings around them. He saw a nation so focused on its own forward momentum that it seemed to have forgotten a fundamental rule of the road. In his notebook, Daniel added another line, a thought that felt less like an observation and more like the beginning of a thesis. Before seeking to be understood, one must first understand. This simple axiom would become the guiding principle of his journey. A few days later, his reporting took him south, into the very heart of the region his story was about. His next stop was Bangkok. It was there he would begin to truly grasp the weight of that one simple word, understanding. The afternoon heat of Bangkok was a thick, tangible presence, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of Seoul. Inside a hotel conference room, packed to the gills with the international press, the air was still but charged with anticipation. The spokesperson for ASEAN, a poised Thai diplomat, stood at the podium, her hands resting gently on the lectern. She began to speak, her voice calm and measured, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "We have no intention of closing the door to dialogue," she stated, her words resonating through the silent room. "However, a negotiation without respect is meaningless." The sentence hung in the air, a direct and unequivocal rebuke. From his seat at the back, Daniel scribbled it down verbatim. A negotiation without respect is meaningless. It was a world away from the slippery excuse of a misunderstanding he had heard in Seoul. This was a statement of principle, clear and unyielding. A flurry of hands shot up. A journalist from a French news agency was the first to be called. If that is the case, which nation will serve as the central partner for economic and security cooperation moving forward? The spokesperson considered the question for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over the room. From a practical standpoint, she said finally, her tone deliberate, we will be strengthening our partnership with the United States. At the mention of the U.S., Daniel's head snapped up. For him, America's role on the world stage was defined by its immense, often loud, presence, grand pronouncements, sweeping policy declarations, and high-profile summits. But in the context of Southeast Asia, he had always perceived its influence as part of a larger geopolitical chess match with China. The idea of the U.S. as a preferred, trusted partner for ASEAN on this level felt new. He vaguely recalled headlines about American initiatives in the region, but they were often overshadowed by more dramatic global events. Why the U.S. now? The question burned in his mind, and before he knew it, his hand was in the air. The spokesperson's eyes found him, and she nodded with a small, encouraging smile. Why them? Daniel asked, his voice cutting through the din. Her answer was brief, but it landed with the force of a tectonic shift. Because they're a partner that keeps its promises. The press conference ended, but the spokesperson's words echoed in the corridors as journalists huddled together, excitedly dissecting the new development. A veteran reporter from Singapore sidled up to Daniel. Korea says it will guide. The U.S. says it will partner, he said with a knowing look. It's not hard to see which is more appealing, is it? Daniel could only offer a wry smile in response. While waiting for the elevator, he looked out through a large plate glass window at the sweltering city below. Southeast Asia, this vast and dynamic market of over 600 million people, larger even than the European Union. Yet it was a region of stark contrasts, of immense developmental gaps. The core principle of non-interference, designed to preserve sovereignty, often hindered swift, collective action. What had been academic knowledge on a briefing page just days ago was now playing out before him as a living, breathing drama. And in the middle of it all, the United States was winning trust not through rhetoric, but through reliability. Action over words. Returning to the hotel lobby, Daniel found himself murmuring aloud, is it the quiet ones who hold the most influence? Back in Seoul, the night air seemed even colder, heavier than before. On the towering digital screens that lined the boulevards, news tickers ran on a constant loop. ASEAN-TO strengthened cooperation with the United States. In cafes and bars, the conversations were laced with a bitter resentment. The Americans are at it again, trying to undermine us, a young man muttered into his coffee, his words a common refrain. They want to steal the leadership role that is rightfully ours. From the quiet lounge of his hotel, Daniel watched a Korean government spokesperson on the television, his face a mask of stern composure. We are closely monitoring the United States movements, he declared. Korea will continue to play its central role in the region. The confident words rang hollow, a desperate attempt to assert a reality that was rapidly slipping away. A man sitting next to him at the bar, a Korean businessman by the look of his tailored suit, turned to him. You're with the foreign press, aren't you? Yes, from London, Daniel replied. My first time covering this part of the world. The man chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Then you must be surprised. Everyone here speaks so loudly. They believe that silence is defeat. He took a slow sip. But a quiet partner, like the Americans, that's who you have to watch out for. They are the truly formidable ones. Daniel leaned in, intrigued. Formidable? How so? They don't make grand speeches. They just act, the man explained, his voice low and conspiratorial. They take the trust right out from under you while you're busy shouting. The more Korea talks, the more the U.S. quietly delivers. There is power in that silence. Power in silence. Daniel turned the phrase over in his mind. He opened his notebook and wrote, America's silent power. A nation that speaks not with words, but with commitments. He looked out the window of his room at the dark, shimmering surface of the Han River. The sounds of the city, the murmur of conversations, the blare of car horns, the ceaseless urban hum, rose up to meet him. And in that cacophony, he suddenly realized what was missing from this city, from its politics, from its very soul, the habit of listening. He had been just as guilty. In his career, he had always been chasing the soundbite, the quote, the declaration. He was trained to document what was said, not what was felt. He had prioritized the pronouncements of politicians over the quiet truths held by the people they governed. Could it be, he wondered, that the real story is found not in the noise but in the spaces between the words? The emergency ASEAN summit reconvened in Seoul, the air thick with an almost palpable tension. The streets around the International Conference Center were choked with media vans, their satellite dishes pointed to the sky like a field of metallic sunflowers. The relentless flash of cameras strode against the gray morning, a visual representation of the intense public interest in the diplomatic standoff. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was electric. The lead Korean delegate strode to the microphone, his posture rigid with defiance. His voice boomed through the speakers, an instrument of forceful persuasion. For the stability of this region, we have consistently played a leading role. In the future, Korea will continue to serve as the center to guide ASEAN forward. The ASEAN delegates, however, remained impassive, their pens moving across their notepads with a detached, clinical precision. Daniel, sitting in the press section, watched them closely. The phrase he had heard in Bangkok echoed in his mind, a partner that keeps its promises. The Korean delegate continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. We respect our partners, including the United States. But the engine that will drive Asia forward is Korea. At that declaration, a visible ripple of agitation went through the room. The Vietnamese ambassador frowned deeply. The delegate from the Philippines lowered his gaze, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. Tucked away in a corner of the hall, observing the proceedings with a quiet, unobtrusive presence, was James Sullivan, a senior diplomat from the U.S. Embassy. He had no official speaking role at the session. He was present only as an observer, invited at the express request of the ASEAN contingent. He did not seek the floor. He simply listened, absorbing every word, every nuance, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the escalating drama. Yet his very presence seemed to hold its own weight. As the discussion progressed, the Korean delegate became more animated. Korea's economic power and technological prowess are the ultimate model for ASEAN. We must guide them onto the correct path. At that moment, a senior ASEAN ambassador from the front row looked up, his voice cutting cleanly through the tirade. We do not wish to be guided, he stated, his words calm but firm. We seek an equal partnership. The Korean delegate was struck dumb. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. Only the clipped, precise voice of the interpreter echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence. The room froze. The silence stretched, feeling not like seconds, but like an eternity. It was then that James Sullivan slowly raised his hand. The simple, deliberate gesture drew every eye in the room. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was imbued with a quiet authority that commanded instant attention. If I may be permitted a brief remark, he said, his tone one of gentle inquiry rather than demand. The Korean delegate, clearly flustered but unable to refuse, gave a curt nod. Sullivan rose to his feet. Speaking through his interpreter, his words were measured and calm. It seems to me that the most important thing right now is not to argue over who is right, but to demonstrate who is sincere. That single sentence fundamentally altered the chemistry of the room. It was as if a powerful current had been reversed. The hard, defiant expressions on the Korean side faltered, replaced by a stunned confusion. The ASEAN delegates, who had been slumped in weary resignation, sat up straighter. The Vietnamese representative nodded in appreciation. A faint, knowing smile touched the lips of the Indonesian ambassador. Sullivan said nothing more. He simply sat back down, his point made. Daniel watched the scene unfold, holding his breath. Not correctness, but sincerity. The phrase was more potent than an hour-long speech filled with statistics and assertions. A wave of murmuring swept through the press corps. What was that just now? Did the translation get that right? They were confused, but they could all feel the undeniable shift in the room's emotional landscape. The strident tone of the Korean delegates softened. The tense, defensive postures of the ASEAN representatives relaxed. The possibility of understanding, not just confrontation, began to permeate the air. Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. A message could be delivered without shouting. After the session concluded, the delegates rose, and the hall slowly emptied, a residual heat of emotion still hanging in the air. Amidst the cacophony of reporters shouting questions, Sullivan's words kept replaying in Daniel's mind, not who is right, but who is sincere. As the crowd thinned, Daniel spotted Sullivan walking down a quiet, empty corridor with an aide. On impulse, Daniel hurried after him. "Mr. Sullivan, a moment of your time?" The American diplomat paused and turned, his expression open and patient. The same steady calm he had projected in the hall was still present in his eyes. "Why did you speak up in there?" Daniel asked. "You weren't officially on the agenda." Sullivan chose his words carefully. "Listening is also a form of speech, Mr. Haas. But sometimes, simple, silent listening isn't enough to convey the message. Today, I felt it was necessary to give a voice to the silence in the room." Daniel was captivated, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Give a voice to the silence? Sincerity, Sullivan continued, his voice low and resonant, is found in patience, not in posturing. Diplomacy is like any human relationship. The more you rush it, the further trust recedes. Daniel nodded slowly, a profound sense of recognition dawning on him. He felt as if the words were meant for him as much as for the delegates in the hall. He managed a slight smile. Diplomats like you must be a nightmare for journalists. You make it very difficult to write a headline. A quiet, genuine smile touched Sullivan's lips. Then write a story where the headline doesn't matter, he suggested. Write something that stays with the reader long after they've forgotten the bold print. With a slight nod, Sullivan turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty hall. Daniel stood there for a long time, feeling something fundamental shifting within his professional core. Words that could be conveyed without volume. Understanding born from silence. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote a single line. The courage to listen is what builds trust. The following week, news programs around the globe replayed the clip of that single, quiet sentence from the Seoul summit. U.S. diplomats remarked silence's hall. The narrative was consistent. The measure of diplomacy was not the volume of words, but the depth of sincerity. The headlines all pointed to the same conclusion. On a major American news network, the director of a prominent international think tank coined a new term. What we're seeing from the U.S. and Asia is a form of strategic silence. Even without making pronouncements, their actions are accumulating trust. In Indonesia, a young diplomat posted on social media, American support is quiet, but it is tangibly changing our lives. At the same time, the results of a new Pan-ASEAN public opinion poll were released. When asked, which nation is your most trusted partner? The United States came in first, with 68%, an 8-point jump from the previous year, marking the 7th consecutive year it had held the top spot. The international media seized upon the results with fervor. From his home office in London, Daniel read the reports, a sense of validation settling over him. The volume of one's voice does not determine its truth. In the silence, a power was gathering that could move the world. He murmured the thought to himself and opened his notebook. Inside were the copious notes he had compiled on America's long history in the region, a history that began decades ago. It wasn't a flashy, branded policy, but a steady, consistent engagement. Starting in the 1990s, USAID had quietly funded critical infrastructure projects, roads, ports, and power plants that formed the backbone of emerging economies. During the Asian financial crisis, it was American financial aid, funneled through international bodies, that helped stabilize the region's teetering markets. In the 2010s, this partnership deepened through initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Partnership, a framework for funding everything from economic integration and education to disaster relief and infectious disease control. In education, American grants had helped build and supply over 1,000 schools in Cambodia and Laos. In disaster management, they were instrumental in establishing ASEAN's Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance. During the COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. CDC expertise and funding were foundational in creating the ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies. All told, the direct support over the years amounted to tens of billions of dollars. And yet, America rarely used the word aid. The official language was always partnership. It was a relationship built on listening to local needs. A senior Singaporean official had told Daniel during an interview, "America's strength is its consistency. When they make a commitment, they see it through. The whole world could forget, but they will deliver." Recalling those words, Daniel picked up his pen and wrote in the margin of his notes, "Sincerity is not declared. It is accumulated, one action at a time." His entire perception of the country's foreign policy had been reshaped. The nation he had once seen primarily through the lens of great power competition was revealing a different face, one defined not by speeches or summits, but by the patient, steady accumulation of actions. That evening, he finished his article. The title was simple: The Diplomacy of Silence, How America Showcased True Power. He hit send, and a quiet sense of relief washed over him. Daniel's article detonated across the global media landscape overnight. In Europe, the phrase "sincerity over speech" trended on social media. In Asia, it became a major topic of conversation. The morning in Seoul, however, brought a furious backlash. The Korean press was unified in its condemnation. A biased report favoring the U.S. A journalist's betrayal. On talk shows, pundits raged, their faces contorted with indignation. Silence is not diplomacy. The U.S. is manipulating the narrative from the shadows. The studio air crackled with anger. Daniel watched it all from his hotel room, his own name flashing in the subtitles on the screen. Social media was a firestorm of polarized opinions. He's telling the truth. He's a mouthpiece for Washington. He must have been paid off. The loudest voices, as always, generated the most echo. But as the days passed, the atmosphere began to change. The first shift came from the Philippines, where the national television network produced a special report quoting a line from Daniel's article. The program's host concluded by saying, "Silence is not a tactic. The act of listening is the greatest dialogue of all." The sentiment resonated deeply with viewers. Then, in Indonesia, university students began posting, "The U.S. keeps its promises." The comment sections filled with phrases like, "We are tired of loud countries," and "We need quiet partners." A leading Malaysian economist wrote a widely circulated op-ed, "Korea captured attention, but the U.S. won trust. Attention is fleeting. Trust spans generations." Even within South Korea, small cracks began to appear in the wall of outrage. An opposition journalist, writing anonymously, posted online, "Perhaps we have been too intoxicated with the idea that assertion is diplomacy. The world is beginning to see another kind of value." Daniel found the post and paused his scrolling, a small smile touching his lips. Amidst the storm of criticism, a tiny seed of resonance was beginning to sprout. One evening, back in London, Daniel met with journalist friends at a pub. A Korean correspondent clapped him on the shoulder with a wry grin. "Your article made my editor furious," he said. "But between us, everyone knows why ASEAN applauded the Americans at that summit." Daniel smiled. People tend to only hear what is convenient for them. But a silent partner hears everything. A few days later, the South Korean government formally announced it would restart negotiations with ASEAN. A Reuters dispatch noted that behind the scenes, the U.S. State Department had been quietly facilitating informal talks to broker the reconciliation. The story was picked up by major newspapers worldwide. Under a typically overcast London sky, Daniel sat in a cafe, a newspaper spread before him. The headline read, "Under U.S. mediation, ASEAN and Korea announce new framework for cooperation." Reading the article, he felt a calm sense of clarity. The American support for ASEAN, in education, disaster relief, healthcare, digitalization, had never been about charity or control. It was the simple posture of walking alongside someone. They didn't make grand pronouncements, but when a town was flooded, medical supplies and technical experts would appear. When a rural village lacked educational resources, desks and blackboards would be delivered. That steady accumulation had, over decades, built an intangible capital called trust. A trust that could move the world, not with force, but with sincerity. This was the form of diplomacy he had witnessed. Outside the cafe window, a gentle rain began to fall. On a fresh page in his notebook, Daniel wrote a new sentence, connecting the future, the U.S. and ASEAN's next 50 years. He knew America would not issue a dramatic declaration, but when they were needed, they would be there. That quiet accumulation of action was an invisible asset, a form of trust that had become the world's most reliable currency. He looked out the window again. Through a break in the distant clouds, a pale sliver of sunlight appeared. America's quietness, he mused, was not an end. It was a beginning. He started to outline a new article, adding a short, simple line just below the title. "The silent partner will once again illuminate the world." The words flowing from his pen were no longer just a reporter's observation. They had become his own conviction. Somewhere in the world, the U.S. was extending a hand to someone in need. It was support that asked for nothing in return. And it was the most trusted and most powerful silence in the world.